She walked through the glass doors of Elite Fitness Academy wearing a faded gray hoodie and worn sneakers. Her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no designer gear, just another ordinary woman picking up her daughter from martial arts class. Nobody knew her secret. Nobody could have imagined what would happen when they dared her to fight. Sarah Matthews pushed open the heavy glass doors of Elite Fitness Academy, and immediately the atmosphere enveloped her like a familiar embrace. The air was thick with the metallic tang of sweat, the sharp scent of determination, and something else that made her pulse quicken and awaken memories she had spent 5 years burying. At 28, Sarah possessed an understated beauty that seemed almost deliberate in its camouflage. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, the same style she'd worn in her final, devastating fight when everything had fallen apart. She wore a faded gray hoodie and well-worn jeans that spoke of countless errands and soccer practices. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as she moved with unconscious grace, though beneath that careful restraint lay reflexes that could still explode into lethal precision. This was exactly the kind of woman people's eyes would slide past in grocery store lines, at school pickup, in coffee shops, the invisible army of mothers who kept the world turning while remaining perpetually unnoticed. Sarah had cultivated this anonymity with the same discipline others might cultivate a garden, understanding that sometimes the greatest strength lay in being underestimated, a lesson learned through betrayal and the brutal realization that the world she dominated as Lightning Matthews had never truly respected her as anything more than a spectacle. Across the expansive training floor, her daughter Emma moved with focused intensity, and the reason Sarah had walked away from everything, at 16, Emma possessed all the fire and determination that Sarah remembered from her own youth, but channeled into something beautiful and controlled, untainted by the corruption that had destroyed her mother's dreams. The blue mats beneath Emma's feet seemed to pulse with energy as she executed a series of kicks with increasing confidence. Sarah's heart swelled with protective love, tinged with desperate fear that this world might eventually break her daughter's spirit the way it had shattered her own. "Mom." Emma's voice cut through the ambient noise, her face illuminated with pure joy that made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. Emma's wave was enthusiastic, unself-conscious, and Sarah felt familiar gratitude for this moment, this ordinary Tuesday afternoon that felt precious and fleeting. Sarah returned the wave with a gentle smile that carried shadows of old wounds, then made her way to the familiar bench where parents gathered to wait. She settled into the worn cushion, pulled out her phone and began scrolling through emails that seemed suddenly trivial. Emails that reminded her too much of championship fights, back when she'd believed the world was fair and talent was all that mattered. But despite her best intentions to focus on mundane tasks, Sarah's eyes kept drifting back to the training floor, drawn by magnetic force she couldn't quite explain, or perhaps by a familiar dread that came from recognizing predatory behavior in positions of authority. It was then that her gaze landed on him, and everything else seemed to fade into background noise, replaced by cold recognition of a familiar type of man, the kind who had destroyed her career and broken her faith in everything she'd once held sacred. Marcus Kane commanded the center of the room with the kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it, the same suffocating charisma that had once made her trust the wrong people. He was tall and imposing, his muscular frame moving with fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. The black belt wrapped around his waist seemed less like an accessory and more like a crown. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw sharp, and his eyes held cold calculation of someone who saw the world in terms of winners and losers, with himself firmly in the former category and women permanently relegated to the latter. But it wasn't his physical presence that made Sarah's stomach clench with unease. It was the way he wielded authority like a weapon, particularly against the girls in his classes. The same casual cruelty that had driven her from the sport she'd once loved. She had been coming here for months now, observing him with careful attention, and what she had seen troubled her more with each passing week. "Higher, Madison. What is this, amateur hour?" Marcus's voice cut through the training noise like a blade, sharp and dismissive. The target of his criticism was a young blonde girl whose face immediately flushed with embarrassment, Sarah watched as the girl's confidence visibly deflated and felt familiar rage build in her chest, the same fury that had cost her everything when she'd finally snapped. The pattern was always the same. Marcus pushed the girls harder than the boys, criticized them more harshly, seemed to take particular pleasure in breaking down their confidence. It was the same systemic disrespect that had made her realize her championship belts were nothing more than pretty accessories in a game where she would never be considered an equal participant. Maybe you should stick to cheerleading. Marcus sneered at another girl who had missed her target. The cruelty was casual, almost offhand, which somehow made it even more devastating. Sarah watched as the girl's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears she fought desperately to contain. Sarah's hands slowly clenched into fists as familiar fire began to build in her chest, the same volcanic rage that had erupted 5 years ago when she'd discovered that her trusted coach had been systematically undermining her confidence while selling information about her training to her opponents. The protective instincts that had been honed through years of motherhood were now screaming at her to act. What Marcus Kane didn't know, what none of them knew as they watched this seemingly ordinary woman sitting quietly on her bench, was that he had just awakened something that had been dormant for 5 years, something that had once made grown men think twice before stepping into a ring with her. Sarah Lightning Matthews was no longer sleeping. Marcus Kane moved across the training floor with predatory confidence, his steps deliberate and measured like a wolf circling its territory. There was something theatrical about the way he carried himself, as if he were perpetually performing for an audience. His cold eyes swept across the assembled parents with methodical precision before settling on Sarah, something shifting in his expression, a cruel amusement that transformed his features into something predatory and ugly. The mocking smile that twisted his lips suggested he had found exactly what he was looking for, a perfect target for whatever demonstration of power he had been planning. It was the smile of someone who had never learned the difference between strength and cruelty. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the gym with practiced projection. There was a theatrical quality to his tone, as if he were a ringmaster preparing to unveil the main attraction. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implication and threat. The transformation of the gym's atmosphere was immediate and complete. Conversations died mid-sentence, training equipment fell silent, and even the youngest students stopped their movements. The space suddenly felt charged with tension, as if the very air had become thick and difficult to breathe. "I want to show you the difference between real martial arts training and—" Marcus paused with calculated timing, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. His finger rose slowly, deliberately, before pointing directly at Sarah. "Whatever it is regular people think they know about fighting." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of discomfort. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks with intensity of a physical blow. Around her, the other parents shifted in their seats with collective discomfort. Some of the parents allowed themselves small snickers of amusement, people who had bought into the mythology of tough love coaching, who believed that public embarrassment was somehow character building. "Miss Matthews, Sinit," Marcus called out, his voice carrying false friendliness that made the underlying cruelty even more apparent. Emma's mom, always sitting there so quietly. So, he paused again, savoring the moment. Ordinary. The word hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Ordinary. It was a word that had followed her through most of her adult life, a label she had learned to wear like armor. "I bet you've never thrown a punch in your life." Marcus continued, his confidence growing with each word. "Am I right?" Sarah's throat went dry, but underneath the fear was something else, a cold, calculating fury that she hadn't felt in 5 years. Every parent in the gym was staring now, but it was Emma's face that truly broke Sarah's heart. Her daughter stood frozen among her classmates, her skin pale with mortification. Sarah could see the exact moment when Emma's pride in her mother began to curdle into shame. "What do you say we give these kids a real lesson?" Marcus's voice dripped with condescension. "Show them what happens when amateurs think they can play in the big leagues." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. This was the moment when she could retreat gracefully, when she could preserve her carefully constructed fiction of ordinary life. She could walk away. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should walk away. But then she saw Emma's face again. Really saw it, and everything else faded into background noise. This was the moment when Emma would learn whether her mother was someone who stood up for herself and others, and something deep inside Sarah snapped. "All right," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere with surprising clarity. She stood up slowly, deliberately, her movements carrying a grace that seemed at odds with her simple clothes. "If you want to prove something, let's prove it." The gym erupted in whispers. Marcus's grin widened until it threatened to split his face, his eyes glittering with anticipation of easy victory. "Oh, this is going to be good," he laughed. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll go easy on you." But something in Sarah's posture had changed, something subtle but unmistakable. The sleeping giant hadn't just awakened. Lightning was about to strike. Sarah stepped on into the blue mats with fluid grace of someone returning home after a long exile. Her worn sneakers now moved with precise placement of a predator calculating distance and angle. Around the perimeter, parents and students formed a circle, unaware they were about to witness something that would shatter every assumption they had ever made about strength. Marcus cracked his knuckles with theatrical flair, rolled his shoulders with exaggerated confidence. The sound echoed through the gym like breaking bones. "This will be quick," he announced. "I just want everyone to see the difference between trained professionals and soccer moms who think they're tough." Laughter rippled through the audience, but this time it felt hollow, nervous, as if some primal part of the crowd sensed they were witnessing something far more dangerous than simple bullying. Sarah said nothing, just stood there, her posture relaxed but somehow predatory, like a coiled spring waiting for the perfect moment to release years of accumulated tension. "You sure about this, Mom?" Emma whispered from the edge of the mat. Sarah met her daughter's eyes, and for a moment, Emma glimpsed something that made her breath catch. A cold, calculating fury that belonged to someone who had never learned to accept defeat. She nodded once. Marcus slipped into his fighting stance with theatrical flair, all flash and show. "Ready to embarrass yourself," he taunted. Sarah didn't respond, just stood there, perfectly still, her breathing controlled and meditative. Just waited. Marcus threw his first kick with explosive power, high and fast, designed to end the fight before it could truly begin. Sarah tilted her head slightly, and the kick that should have connected with devastating force instead cut through empty air. The miss was so clean, so effortless, that for a moment the crowd wasn't sure what they had witnessed. "Lucky dodge," Marcus scoffed, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. He launched into a combination that had ended countless sparring sessions, punches and kicks in rapid succession, designed to overwhelm an amateur. But Sarah moved like water around his attacks, flowing away from each strike with an economy of motion that seemed to mock effort itself, never rushing, never panicking, just moving. The crowd began to murmur with nervous energy. This wasn't what they'd come to see. Marcus's confident smile started to fade, replaced by dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. "What the hell?" Marcus breathed as another flurry of strikes hit nothing but air. Sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. Sarah hadn't thrown a single punch, hadn't even broken a sweat. She simply moved with eerie precision that made his best techniques look clumsy and amateurish. "Stop dancing around," Marcus snarled, panic disguised as anger. "Fight back." But Sarah remained silent, her movements growing more fluid, more precise, as if she were remembering something that had been dormant for years. The parents were no longer laughing. They watched in stunned silence as this ordinary woman made their champion instructor look like a fool. "She's toying with him," someone whispered. Marcus heard it, and rage flashed in his eyes. He came at her with everything he had, abandoning technique for raw power. Sarah's expression never changed, but something in her stance shifted almost imperceptibly. Then, without warning, she moved. Not away this time. Forward. Marcus threw his most powerful punch, every muscle committed to the strike, every ounce of strength focused on finally connecting with this elusive target. Sarah caught his wrist mid-strike with casual ease, her grip deceptively gentle but somehow managing to stop his most powerful technique. The impact created a sound like a gunshot that echoed through the suddenly silent gym. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Sarah twisted slightly, applied just enough pressure to demonstrate the vast difference between their capabilities, and Marcus dropped to one knee with a gasp of pain. "What? How?" he stammered. Sarah released him and stepped back. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the gym. "My name isn't just Sarah Matthews," she said quietly. "It's Sarah Lightning Matthews, former UFC women's bantamweight champion." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Parents fumbled for their phones, searching and confirming, their faces illuminating with screens that displayed images of Sarah in her fighting prime. "Three-time champion," Sarah continued matter-of-factly. "32 fights, 32 wins." Marcus stared up at her, his face white with shock. "I retired 5 years ago," Sarah said, her voice carrying sadness. "When Emma was born, I wanted a quiet life." She looked around the circle of stunned faces. "But I won't stand by and watch you tear down these girls. Won't let you make them feel small just to feed your own ego." Sarah knelt beside Marcus, her movement carrying no trace of triumph, only the quiet sadness of someone who had seen too much cruelty. Her voice was gentle now, carrying compassion that could only come from someone who had chosen forgiveness over revenge. "Real strength isn't about proving you're better than everyone else," she said. "It's about lifting others up, teaching with respect, building confidence, not destroying it." Marcus couldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the mat beneath him. The great instructor, reduced to silence by a suburban mom who had just demonstrated the vast difference between his understanding of strength and its reality. Emma pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of embarrassment now, but tears of pride mixed with overwhelming realization that her mother was actually a living legend. "I knew you were strong, Mom," Emma whispered as Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter. "But I never knew you were this." Sarah smiled and brushed a tear from her daughter's cheek. "Strength comes in many forms, sweetheart," she said softly. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay quiet. Sometimes you have to speak up. The key is knowing when to do which." Around them, the other girls began to approach hesitantly, their faces bright with new respect and hope. Could you teach us?" one girl asked hesitantly. Sarah looked at Marcus, still stunned by what he had awakened. "That's up to Mr. Kane," she said quietly. "This is his gym." All eyes turned to the fallen instructor, waiting. Marcus slowly got to his feet, his pride shattered, his arrogance gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at the floor as if trying to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. Then, quietly, "I'm sorry." The words barely audible, but somehow they carried more weight than all his previous bluster combined. "I'm sorry to all of you," he said louder, his voice cracking. "I thought being tough meant being harsh. I thought breaking you down would make you stronger." He looked at Sarah, at the girls he'd humiliated. "I was wrong." The apology hung in the air, raw and genuine. Sarah nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes, Marcus. What matters is what we do next. Would you?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Would you consider staying, helping me teach these girls? They deserve better than what I've been giving them." Sarah looked around the gym, at Emma's hopeful face, at the other girls watching with bright eyes. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the familiar stirring of purpose. "I think I'd like that," she said. 6 months later, Elite Fitness Academy buzzed with new energy that was palpable from the moment you walked through the doors. The walls were covered with photos now, not just Marcus's achievements, but pictures of every student, every small victory as celebrated, every moment of growth captured and honored. The atmosphere had transformed from one of intimidation and hierarchy to one of mutual respect and genuine encouragement. Sarah stood at the edge of the mats watching Emma spar with another girl, both of them confident, strong, respected. The transformation in the gym's culture was evident in every interaction. Students helping each other up after falls, celebrating each other's progress, learning that true martial arts was about building character, not breaking spirits. Marcus approached, his entire demeanor transformed from the arrogant instructor who had once ruled through fear and intimidation. His arrogance had been replaced with genuine humility, his casual cruelty with patient encouragement. The change wasn't just superficial, it ran deep, born from the humbling realization that true strength had nothing to do with domination and everything to do with service. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine gratitude mixed with ongoing amazement at the grace he'd been shown. "For not giving up on me, on this place, for showing me what real teaching looks like." Sarah smiled, watching as Emma helped her sparring partner up after a particularly good throw, the girls laughing together in the spirit of mutual respect that now permeated every class. No humiliation, no shame, just the pure joy of learning and growing together. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she replied, her voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned that forgiveness was often the most powerful weapon of all. Even stubborn instructors who think they know everything. Marcus laughed, actually laughed, a sound that would have been impossible in the toxic environment he had once created. The laughter was free of the cruel edge that had once characterized his interactions, replaced by genuine warmth and self-deprecating humor. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think strength was about never backing down, never showing weakness, never admitting you were wrong." "And now?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from watching his transformation over the past months. "Now I know real strength is admitting when you're wrong, having the courage to change, and understanding that the strongest people are often the ones who choose to lift others up instead of tearing them down." Sarah nodded, her gaze returning to Emma and the other students who were now thriving in an environment that celebrated their potential rather than trying to break their spirits. The change had rippled outward from that single moment of confrontation, transforming not just the gym, but the lives of everyone who trained there. "Sometimes the most important battles," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had fought both literal and metaphorical wars, "aren't won with fists. They're won with patience, with compassion, with the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone diminish that light in yourself or others." She turned to Marcus, her expression serious but kind, carrying all the weight of the lesson they had both learned through pain and growth. "Remember that, teach that, and these girls will become stronger than either of us ever imagined." As the afternoon sun streamed through the gym windows, casting long shadows across the mats where young women were learning that strength came in many forms, Sarah smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had found her purpose again. She discovered that walking away from her championship career hadn't been the end of her story. It had been preparation for something far more important. Not as Lightning Matthews, the champion who had dominated opponents in the octagon, but as Sarah Matthews, the teacher, the protector, the quiet storm who refused to let anyone diminish the light in others. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories weren't won in front of crowds or cameras, but in small moments when you chose to stand up for what was right, even when, especially when, the cost seemed too high to bear. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose to hide their strength until the moment comes when hiding is no longer an option. And in that moment, they remind the world what real power looks like. Not the power to destroy, but the power to transform, to heal, to create something better from the ashes of what came before. The legend of Lightning Matthews lived on, not in record books or highlight reels, but in the confident voices of young women who had learned that they were worthy of respect, that their strength was real, and that they had every right to take up space in the world. And that, Sarah realized as she watched her daughter laugh with joy and confidence was a legacy worth any sacrifice. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? Share your story in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of quiet strength and unexpected heroes. Remember, true power isn't about what others see on the surface. It's about what burns bright in your heart.